Pick anything you
Look,
want, he said,
what is that?
until his daughter said,
What is
we want
happening
that
here?
Apache woman as our mom. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The plains north of Fort Bridger carried a late-season chill that settled into clothing and stiffened hands even before the sun dropped. Elias Rourke guided his wagon along the dirt track at a steady pace, observing the faint frost forming in shaded patches near the brush line. His daughters sat close together on the seat, wrapped in thick blankets. June kept her chin tucked into the fabric, while Hannah watched the lanterns of the traveling supply caravan ahead with quiet interest. Elias had been a widower for 3 years. Since the day his wife died in childbirth, his life had become a narrow path built on responsibility. He woke early, checked fences, fed cattle, prepared meals, and kept his daughters safe. He avoided unnecessary talk, avoided town gatherings, avoided anything that distracted from the work of keeping his small ranch alive. He had served as an Army scout long before becoming a family man. And although he left that life behind after refusing an order that weighed on him still, the habits of caution stayed with him. He arrived at the caravan just as the traders were finishing their final transactions. Lanterns hung from wagon frames, casting unsteady light across crates of tools, sacks of beans, folded blankets, and coiled rope. A few men shouted prices while others hammered shut lids or tied down loads. Horses shifted on the far end, their hooves pressing into cold dirt. Elias stepped down from the wagon slowly, feeling the tightness in his back from the week's labor. He unloaded the grain he intended to trade and carried it toward the caravan leader, who counted the sacks with a quick nod. Elias turned toward a row of tools laid out for inspection. He selected a hinge, tested it with his thumb, and weighed whether it would stand up against the wind that often battered his barn door. His mind moved ahead to the chores waiting at home. Splitting more wood, repairing June's coat sleeve, checking the stovepipe before snow settled for good. He was focused on these tasks when he heard a strained breath from somewhere behind the tool crates. It wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of tension that made him look up. June heard it too and shifted her stance, leaning slightly forward. Hannah's small hand tightened around her sister's wrist. Elias lifted his eyes toward the source of the sound. Near the back of the caravan, a young Apache woman stood beside 2 tired horses. The rope around her wrists was tied loose, but it was still rope. Her dress was torn across one shoulder. Dirt marked her forearms and the edges of her clothing. Beadwork hung unevenly on the damaged fabric. Her posture showed exhaustion, legs braced just enough to stay upright, arms held close, breathing shallow. She watched the ground but kept track of movement around her with small, precise shifts of her eyes. A caravan handler pushed a crate aside without looking behind him. The sudden motion forced her to step back quickly, which she did without complaint, though her shoulders tightened as if expecting a strike. June whispered, "She's scared." Hannah pressed closer to Elias's coat. She didn't speak, but the worry in her eyes was clear. Elias observed the woman carefully. She showed no signs of aggression or resistance. She looked like someone who had traveled too far without rest, someone who had reached the limit of what her body could endure. He turned back to the tools, telling himself he had no reason to get involved. He needed stability for his daughters. Bringing in a stranger, especially one who had been passed through caravans, was not part of his plan. The caravan leader walked over, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "You brought good grain, Rourke. Pick whatever you want in return." Elias gestured toward the box of hinges and nails. "These will work." The man nodded, ready to finalize the deal, but the girls' voices stopped the moment. Hannah whispered, "She looks cold." June added, steadier, We want her. We want that woman as our mom." Elias felt a sharp pull in his chest. He turned to his daughters first. Their expressions were open, serious, and afraid for the woman. Then he looked back at her. She had not heard the girls, but she stood with the same drawn posture, hands trembling lightly at her sides, face showing the strain of trying to remain upright. He looked at the caravan leader. "Why is she tied?" "Picked her up after a raid in the foothills," the man said, shrugging as if none of it mattered. "Camp burned. Survivors scattered. She was alone. "We don't have time for trouble. If you want her, take her." Saves us hauling her to the next stop. Elias disliked the casual tone. He disliked the implication that she was an object rather than a person. Most of all, he disliked the faint memory it stirred. Another woman he once failed to help during his army days, a moment he had never spoken about to anyone. He stepped around the crates and approached the woman slowly, making sure she could see his hands. She didn't back away. She didn't lift her chin. She just watched him with a tired, guarded expression. He drew a small knife from his belt and said quietly, "I'm cutting the rope. You're safe." He placed the blade carefully against the cord and sliced through it. The rope fell to the ground. She didn't rub her wrists. She simply lowered her hands, unsure of what came next. Her breathing changed slightly, not easier yet, but no longer held tight. Elias lifted his chin toward the wagon. "Come with us. You won't be hurt." Her eyes met his for the first time. He saw fear mixed with uncertainty, but also something else, an awareness that she no longer had the strength to walk anywhere on her own. She stepped toward the wagon slowly, using the side rail for balance as she climbed up. June moved aside immediately. Hannah offered a blanket with both hands. The woman accepted it without lifting her gaze, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. Elias returned to the driver's seat, took a steady breath, and snapped the reins gently. The horses began pulling the wagon away from the caravan. The night air grew colder as they traveled, the sound of the wheels blending with the distant cry of a coyote. No one spoke. The only movement came from the woman adjusting the blanket and the girls watching her with quiet concern. Elias kept his eyes on the road, mind turning through the consequences of what he had just done. He didn't regret it, but he understood the weight of it. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman whose past he didn't yet know, a woman who had already endured more than most men could survive. His daughters had acted out of instinct, not understanding the complexities he now had to navigate. But as the plains stretched ahead and the lights of the caravan disappeared behind them, Elias accepted the simple truth settling inside him. Leaving her, there had never been an option he could live with. The wagon reached the Rourke homestead long after the last daylight faded. The cabin's outline appeared first as a dark shape against the wide plains, then sharpened as the horses approached the corral. A single lantern burned near the porch, its light steady in the still air. Elias pulled the reins gently, bringing the team to a halt. The girls climbed down with practiced care, their boots hitting the ground softly. The Apache woman remained seated for a moment, examining the cabin with guarded caution, unsure how to enter a place that was not hers. Elias stepped to her side. "You can come inside. It's warmer there." His voice remained calm, without pressure. She reacted with a small nod, then stood carefully, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before stepping down from the wagon. Her movements were slow, not due to reluctance, but fatigue so deep that even standing required concentration. Inside the cabin, warmth spread from the iron stove. June lit an extra lantern, placing it on the table. Hannah moved blankets from a chair to make space. The interior was tidy, two small beds pushed against the far wall, Elias's cot near the stove, shelves lined with jars, tools stacked under the window. Life here was simple, efficient, and built on routines that left no time for clutter. The woman hesitated at the doorway. The scent of wood smoke and cooked beans filled the air, a smell she recognized but had not felt safe around in weeks. Elias noticed her uncertainty and stepped aside so she would not feel cornered. She entered slowly, taking in every detail, weighing whether the quiet inside was genuine or temporary. Elias set a pot on the stove. "There's food left from earlier. It's not much, but it's warm." She didn't answer, though her eyes followed the steam rising from the pot. Hunger pulled at her, but she waited, unsure if she had permission to approach the table. Hannah placed a tin cup on the bench and filled it with water. She looked at the woman without fear. "You can drink. It's clean." The woman accepted the cup carefully, her fingers shaking as she lifted it. The first sip steadied her breathing. The second eased the tension in her shoulders. June sat on the edge of her bed, watching closely, trying to understand how someone could look so strong and so unsteady at the same time. She spoke quietly, as though raising her voice might startle their guest. "What's your name?" The woman lowered the cup, hesitating before answering. "Naya." Her voice was low, roughened from days of silence. Elias stirred the pot, listening. He didn't turn, not wanting her to feel scrutinized. He served her a small bowl of beans and set on the table without pushing it toward her. She stepped forward only when she felt certain no one expected anything from her except to eat. While she ate, Elias finally allowed himself to study her more closely. Her face held bruises that were fading, but still visible. Her arms showed the thin marks of rope that had been tied too often in recent days. She sat straight, even when exhausted, as though lowering her posture would be a sign of weakness she couldn't afford. He asked nothing. Not yet. He didn't want to force her to relive anything on the first night. The girls eventually settled into their beds. Hannah kept watching Naya with half-closed eyes, as though afraid she might disappear if she looked away. June whispered something to her sister, then pulled the blankets up to her chin. Elias stood by the stove, rubbing warmth into his hands. He glanced at Naya's thin clothing, at the torn fabric near her shoulder, at the way she kept her feet close together for warmth. He opened a chest near his cot and took out a folded wool shawl. "You can use this tonight," he said, placing it on the corner of the table. "The nights get colder out here." She stared at the shawl for a moment, unsure whether accepting it meant some obligation she didn't understand. When she finally reached for it, her movements were slow, as if testing whether the offer would be withdrawn. "You'll sleep there." Elias pointed to the far corner of the cabin, where he had placed a spare blanket on the floor earlier. "It's not much, but it's safe." The word safe made something shift in her expression. Not relief, but a small release in the lines around her mouth. A visible acknowledgement that she understood the difference between temporary shelter and genuine refuge. Naya sat on the blanket, adjusting her borrowed shawl. She scanned the cabin a final time, checking door, window, stove, distance to the girls, as if creating a map she needed for rest. Elias poured himself a small amount of water and stood in the quiet room, aware of her presence in a way he hadn't expected. Her silence didn't press into the space. It settled, cautious and uncertain, but without threat. He spoke once more before putting out the lantern. "No one here will ever hurt you. That's the only rule this home has." She lifted her eyes. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. But the tension in her posture eased a fraction, enough to show she had heard him clearly. When the lantern went dark, the room filled with the soft breathing of 2 children and the crackling of the stove. Naya lay awake a long time, listening for danger out of habit. Elias lay awake too, listening to her adjust her blanket and settle into a space she hadn't asked for but needed. Neither of them spoke again, but the uneasy silence slowly changed shape. Something no longer built on fear, but on the first thin layer of trust forming between strangers who needed more from each other than they knew how to say. A pale strip of light appeared along the eastern horizon before anyone spoke. The stove had burned low during the night, leaving a faint warmth that clung to the cabin's wood walls. Elias rose first, careful not to wake the girls. He moved with practiced quiet, pulling on his boots, adjusting his coat, and checking the firebox to judge how much kindling he needed. The air inside the cabin held the cold of early dawn, enough to make his breath show when he leaned forward. Naya stirred in the corner, lifting her head slightly, but not sitting up. She looked around with the alertness of someone who had spent many nights in unsafe places and did not yet trust morning light. Her blanket had slipped halfway down, and she pulled it back around her shoulders without meeting Elias's eyes. He nodded once, acknowledging her presence without forcing conversation. He opened the door and stepped outside. Frost covered the ground in a thin layer that cracked softly beneath his boots. The horses stood near the fence, breath rising in slow clouds. He crossed the yard to the pump, working the handle until cold water splashed against the metal bucket. The temperature stung his hands, but he kept moving, knowing the animals needed water before the sun warmed the day. By the time he stepped back inside, June was awake, hair messy, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward Naya before saying anything. "Did you sleep?" June asked quietly. Naya paused. "Enough." Her answer was short but genuine, surprising even to her. It had been the first night in weeks where she hadn't been tied, shoved, or forced to flee. Hannah woke next, tucking her feet beneath her body as she sat up. She scanned the room, saw Naya still there, and relaxed. Hannah's relief carried a softness that didn't need words. She simply rose and moved to help her father without hesitation. Elias set the pot on the stove and poured in water. The crackle of kindling replaced silence as he worked. Naya watched him, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to understand the rhythms of this place. She didn't know what was expected of her yet, and studied every movement for clues. She rose slowly, holding the blanket around her body with one hand. Her legs ached from days of travel and nights spent in harsh conditions. She stepped toward the table, but kept a respectful distance from the stove. Elias turned slightly when he noticed. "You can sit if you want. The room warms faster if no one stands near the door." She obeyed, lowering herself onto the nearest chair. The wood was worn smooth by years of use. Her fingers gripped the edge as she adjusted her posture. She didn't want to seem idle, but she also didn't know which tasks she was allowed to touch. June brought her a tin cup of warm water. "It helps in the morning." Naya accepted it with both hands, feeling heat seep into her fingers. She nodded in thanks, but did not speak. Elias watched from the stove. He saw the guarded way Naya held herself, the quick glances toward the windows, the small movements that revealed she was still ready to run if danger appeared. He didn't tell her she was safe. He had said that once already. Trust took time, and he would not press her for anything she wasn't ready to give. Breakfast was simple, porridge stirred until thick, eaten without ceremony. Hannah swung her legs beneath the bench while she chewed. June ate more slowly, observing Naya with thoughtful interest. Halfway through the meal, Naya set her bowl down and spoke softly. "I can work." Elias lifted his eyes. "You don't have to today." She shook her head. "I want to help." The words carried determination she had not shown the night before. He considered her for a moment. She needed purpose as much as she needed rest. He understood that. A person stripped of everything held onto responsibility as a way to recover a sense of self. "We'll go slow," he said. "Just the simple things." Naya nodded once, grateful her offer had been accepted, but relieved she would not be pushed too hard. After breakfast, the girls bundled into their coats to gather eggs from the chicken coop. Naya followed them outside, the shawl tight around her shoulders. The yard looked different in daylight. Wide pasture, low hills in the distance, a small corral beside the barn. She paused to take it in, grounding herself in a space that was no longer hostile. June held the coop door open. "Watch your step. The ground's slick." Naya stepped carefully, noting the uneven frost. Hannah crouched near the nesting boxes, lifting one egg at a time with serious concentration. Naya watched the girls work, observing their teamwork, their ease with the land, their comfort despite the cold. For the first time since arriving, she felt a faint shift inside her, an awareness that she was standing in a place where children moved without fear. Elias approached from the barn, carrying a small rake. "The corral needs clearing. Only if you feel steady enough." Naya nodded. "I can do that." She took the rake, testing its weight, then walked toward the corral gate. Her steps were measured but not weak. The cold air sharpened her senses, and the simple task gave her a direction she hadn't had in weeks. Elias watched her briefly, then returned to his work without hovering. As she raked, she listened to the quiet around her. Wind brushed through dry grass. Chickens clucked near the coop. The girls laughed about something unexpected. Elias hammered a loose board on the fence with steady rhythm. These sounds were new to her, sound of a place where people lived without running. When she finished, she rested both hands on the rake, catching her breath. Elias walked over and examined her work with a nod. "You did well," he said. "Thank you." His voice carried no judgment, only acknowledgement. She straightened, surprised by how much those two simple words mattered. Before she could answer, Hannah tugged at her sleeve. "We want to show you the creek later. It's not far." Naya looked down at the little girl's hopeful expression. Her instinct was to stay distant. Attachment complicated survival. Yet Hannah's invitation was gentle, without expectation, and something in Naya's chest eased at the thought of walking somewhere without being pushed or dragged. She nodded. "All right." Hannah grinned, running to tell June. Elias watched the exchange quietly, understanding more than he said. Naya wasn't just recovering strength. She was beginning to allow the idea of belonging to form, even if she didn't recognize it yet. The morning moved on, and for the first time since joining the Rourke family, Naya felt the weight of fear lift just enough for her lungs to fill fully. It was not safety she believed in yet. It was possibility. The afternoon settled over the Rourke ranch with a muted calm that spread across the yard and drifted into the fields beyond. The frost had melted into thin streaks of water along the fence posts, and the ground softened slightly under the late-day sun. Elias finished repairing a loose shutter on the cabin and set the hammer aside, brushing the dust from his gloves. He noticed Naya standing near the corral, her posture firm but uncertain, as though she was trying to determine her place in a space that still felt unfamiliar. June and Hannah sat on a fallen log nearby, whispering to one another about whether Naya might want help with chores. They wanted to approach her, but hesitated, trying to respect boundaries they didn't fully understand. Elias understood the girl's hesitation. Trust wasn't something that arrived in a single morning. He walked toward Naya with careful steps, making sure she heard him approach. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without losing sight of the yard. "You holding up all right?" he asked. She took a moment before answering. "I can work more if you need." "That's not what I asked," he said, keeping his voice even. "I want to know how you're managing today." Naya took in the question as if it were unfamiliar. No one had asked her how she was in a very long time. "I'm adjusting," she said finally. "Your home is quiet." He nodded. "Quiet can take getting used to." She shifted her weight, eyes moving to the hills in the distance. "I haven't stayed anywhere longer than a night for many weeks." "You don't need to go anywhere now," Elias replied. "Not unless you choose to." Her response was a small, tense breath. She didn't thank him. She didn't offer reassurances. But something in her expression softened slightly, less guarded, less braced for the next command. Before either of them spoke again, Hannah ran toward them with a piece of cloth in her hands. "Pa, the goat's loose again," she called. She got into the woodpile. Elias sighed lightly. That animal never learns. Hannah looked up at Naya. "Do you want to come help?" She listens better when there's more than one person. Naya glanced at Elias, not for permission, but for clarity. He gave a small nod. "Go with her if you feel up to it." Naya followed the girl toward the barn. The goat bleated loudly near the stacked logs, knocking pieces loose with her horns. Hannah circled around, creating a narrow path for Naya to approach. Naya crouched slowly, speaking in a low tone that surprised Hannah. It was calm, steady, and carried a confidence she hadn't shown earlier. The goat froze, ears twitching, as if weighing whether to bolt. Naya extended a hand, palm open. After a long moment, the goat stepped toward her. Hannah grinned with pride. "You're good with animals." Naya guided the goat back toward the barn, closing the latch firmly behind her. "My tribe kept horses," she said quietly, "and dogs. They listen if you give them time." When she turned, Elias was watching from across the yard. The simplicity of the moment and the ease with which she handled the goat told him more about her past than any direct question would have revealed. She had lived a life that required patience and skill, one shaped by responsibility rather than fear. Later, while the girls gathered sticks for the evening fire, Elias approached Naya again. "You want to walk the fence with me?" he asked. "Storm last week loosened part of the eastern side. I could use an extra pair of eyes." She hesitated, uncertain whether leaving the immediate safety of the cabin yard was wise. He noticed her hesitation and added, "We won't go far. You'll stay in sight of the ranch the whole time." Naya nodded once. "I can walk." They moved side by side toward the far field, maintaining a respectful distance. Dry grass brushed against their boots. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from the ridge. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence wasn't heavy. It was tentative, like two people learning how to exist near one another without strain. Elias inspected the fence as they walked. A few posts leaned at angles from a storm, but most remained solid. Naya followed his movements carefully, studying how he checked each section with steady hands. "You built this yourself," she said quietly. "Most of it," he replied. "Neighbors helped with the first stretch. After my wife passed, I finished the rest alone." She absorbed the information with a slow blink. Loss had shaped him too, though he carried it differently than she did. His grief was controlled, folded into his routine. Hers was still raw, sitting close to the surface, unprotected. When they reached the damaged post, Elias pushed against it to test its strength. It wobbled, but not enough to collapse. "I'll reinforce it tomorrow," he said. "Won't fall before then." Naya touched the wood with her fingertips. Her hands were calloused in a way that revealed hard labor, not fragility. "I can help with that," she offered. "Only if you want to," he said. "You're not here to earn your keep." She studied him with a puzzled expression. Men at the caravans said different things. "I'm not them," he answered simply. The words carried weight. Not dramatic weight, practical, steady, believable. Naya lowered her hand from the post and looked toward the cabin, where the girls were stacking wood in a crooked pile. She watched them with an expression that held a mixture of caution and warmth, as though she wasn't sure whether she belonged near them yet, but wanted to understand how belonging worked here. As they walked back, Naya felt a shift in her chest, a quiet awareness that she had not looked over her shoulder once during the entire walk. She had not listened for threats. She had not prepared for escape routes. Her body had gone through a small, unexpected reprieve from survival mode. Inside the cabin, the girls immediately pulled her into their routine. Hannah handed her a small tin bowl. June pointed to the dried beans on the counter. "We make stew on days when Pa works outside late," June explained. "Would you want to help stir?" Naya accepted the wooden spoon. It was a small gesture, but for the first time since arriving, she felt like she was doing something that fit into the rhythm of the home rather than standing at its edges. She stirred slowly, watching the mixture thicken, listening to the bubbling sound that filled the room. Elias entered a few minutes later, removing his coat as he crossed the threshold. He glanced toward the stove. Naya lowered her gaze, uncertain whether she had overstepped by taking part in the cooking. "You did that right," he said. "Stew thickens better if stirred early." Her shoulders eased. Hannah beamed. June passed out tin cups for water. They ate together at the small table. No one asked Naya questions about where she had come from. No one asked her what she had lost. The silence held space for her, not pressure. Elias watched her eat slowly, as if learning how to let her stomach adjust after too many days of scarcity. When dinner ended, Naya helped rinse the bowls in the basin. She did it without being told, moving with quiet diligence. The girls whispered to each other about how she hummed softly under her breath. A simple tune without words, something instinctive rather than planned. Elias stepped outside to check the animals before nightfall. Naya followed him to the doorway, stopping just short of stepping out. "I can help tomorrow," she said, voice steady. "With whatever you need." He studied her carefully. She wasn't offering out of fear. She wasn't trying to earn a place. She was choosing to participate in a small life she hadn't expected to find. "We'll figure out together," he said. Naya closed the door gently. Inside, the girls had already placed a blanket for her in the corner, arranged more neatly than the night before. She stared at the soft folds, unsure how to accept the kindness. For the first time since the raid that shattered her world, she felt her chest loosen. Not fully, not permanently, but enough for her lungs to fill without pain. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like the beginning of something she had not dared imagine. The sun rose through a thin veil of morning haze, giving the yard a muted brightness that softened the sharp lines of the fences and the roof shingles. Elias stepped out early, his breath visible in the cool air. The ground had hardened overnight, leaving a brittle crust over the soil that cracked under his boots. He checked the horses first, brushing frost from their backs and tightening the straps on the feed trough. The animals snorted softly, recognizing his familiar presence. Inside the cabin, Naya folded the blanket she had used with deliberate care. She smoothed the edges as if assuring herself she had left no trace out of place. Her sleep had been fragmented. Several times she woke abruptly, listening for danger, but she had rested better than she expected. The girls slept deeply in their small beds, one curled toward the wall, the other sprawled with one arm over her blanket. They looked peaceful in a way that tightened Naya's throat unexpectedly. She stood, pulled the shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The cold hit immediately, but she welcomed it. It kept her alert. She scanned the yard from habit. Barn doors secure, corral closed, no strangers in sight. Only after confirming everything remained undisturbed did she walk toward Elias. He noticed her approach, but didn't stop brushing the horse. "Morning," he said, brushing a loose strand of mane from his glove. "Sleep all right?" "I slept enough," she answered, voice steady. He nodded once, not pressing for more. He understood the difference between rest and safety. "I'm checking the west pasture today. Fence line goes far enough that it'll take a few hours." She studied his posture, the way he braced his shoulder when tightening a strap. "Do you want help?" "Only if you feel ready," he replied. "It's a long walk." "I can do long walks," she said quietly. He believed her. The strength beneath her calm was unmistakable. The girls came running out moments later, wearing coats that were only half buttoned. June carried a wooden pail. Hannah held two small cloth wrappings. "We packed food for the walk," Hannah announced proudly. Naya blinked, surprised they considered her part of the outing. June held out the pail to her. "You can carry it if you want. It's not heavy." Naya hesitated, then accepted it. The simple act pressed unexpectedly into her chest. Not the weight itself, but the assumption she belonged enough to carry their things. Elias noticed her pause, but said nothing. They left the yard in a slow, steady pace. Elias walked ahead, checking the ground for prints or signs of animal activity. Naya stayed beside the girls, adjusting her steps so Hannah's shorter legs could keep up. The land stretched wide. Open plains, patches of dry brush, the faint shape of distant foothills. The wind carried a clean, crisp smell that mixed with the earth beneath their boots. As they walked, June pointed out a cluster of rabbit tracks leading toward a burrow. "Pa says those tracks mean they were running," she said. Naya knelt to observe them closely. The spacing was irregular, the prints angled sharply. "They were chased," she said. "Something frightened them." "Coyotes?" Hannah asked. "Could be," Naya replied. "Or dog from the hills." The girls looked impressed. Elias heard the exchange and allowed a faint smile to pull at the corner of his mouth. Naya's skills were becoming clear, not loud, but sharp, practical, shaped by a life spent reading the land. They reached the first fence section. The post stood firm, the wires stretched tight. Elias ran his palm along the top beam, checking for looseness. Naya observed his method carefully. He explained quietly, without assuming she knew or didn't know. "Snow weighs down the wire. When spring melt comes, it can pull the post apart." She nodded, running her hand along the wood to feel how it had weathered. "We check fences every season," she said. "My family repaired breaks before they got large." He paused. "Your people lived near foothills?" "North of here, past the ridge," she replied. "Not anymore." He didn't push the conversation further. Her voice held enough finality that he understood the line she had drawn. The next section of fence showed signs of strain. A strong gust must have loosened one side. Elias knelt and began tightening the lower wire. Naya set the pail aside and crouched beside him. She watched his grip, then placed her hands near his to help hold the wire steadier. He glanced at her briefly. "You know how to mend fence?" "Yes." She pressed her weight against the post, keeping it steady while he worked. Everyone worked. No one was too young or too old. Their hands brushed once when passing the tool. It was unplanned, light, and brief, but it caused both to pause. Elias cleared his throat quietly and continued working. Naya pretended not to notice the shift inside her chest. The girls wandered a short distance away, picking up smooth stones and placing them in their pockets as if collecting treasure for later. Their laughter carried across the field, soft and unforced. When the fence was secured, Elias straightened his back with a slow exhale. "Good work," he said to Naya. She didn't answer, but the faint lift in her shoulders showed she heard him. They moved deeper into the pasture as the sun climbed. The land opened even wider here, revealing long stretches of dried grass and scattered patches of sagebrush. A hawk circled above, its shadow passing briefly over their boots. At a narrow bend in the fence, Elias stopped suddenly. "Tracks," he murmured. Naya crouched beside him. A set of deep prints cut across the field, heavy enough to flatten the grass entirely. Her pulse tightened. These weren't animal prints. They were left by boots, multiple pairs, moving in a direction that angled toward the ranch. "When?" she whispered. "Hard to say," Elias replied, scanning the depth and dryness. "Maybe a day, maybe less." The girls approached, unaware of the shift in mood. "Find something?" June asked. Elias kept his tone calm. "Just tracks. Nothing to worry about." Naya knew better. She met his eyes, reading the caution he didn't voice aloud. She had traveled recently enough to know the patterns of men who wandered with no good reason. Elias lowered his voice. "We'll finish quickly and head back." She nodded. From then on, the walk carried a new tension. Naya checked every rise in the land, every cluster of brush, measuring distance and angles in case danger appeared. Elias walked closer to the girls. His hand drifted toward the rifle slung across his back more than once. By midday, they reached the creek that marked the far edge of the property. The water ran thin but clear. The girls crouched near the bank, touching the icy surface with their fingertips. Hannah waved for Naya to join them. Naya knelt beside them, dipping her hand into the water. The cold numbed her skin instantly, but she kept her hand submerged, watching the current carry small flecks of dirt downstream. The creek reminded her of a place she had not visited since the raid. Another stream, another morning when life had still been whole. A flicker of pain crossed her face. June noticed. She didn't ask anything. She simply moved closer until her shoulder touched Naya's arm. The contact startled Naya at first, but she didn't pull away. The child's quiet presence grounded her more than words could have. Elias watched from a few feet away. The small scene settled something deep inside him. Naya wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to soften toward the girls, even if she didn't realize it yet. They ate the small lunch the girls had packed: bread slices, dried apples, and a small piece of jerky shared among them. Naya chewed slowly and used to eating without rushing or guarding her food. When they finished, Elias stood. "We should head back. I want to check those tracks again from the ridge." Naya rose immediately. Her alertness had returned. The peaceful creek could not erase the possibility of danger. The walk home was quicker. The wind had picked up, carrying thin threads of dust across the field. The cabin came into view, small and sturdy against the rising gusts. When they finally stepped into the yard, Naya paused, scanning everything again. Door latch secure, windows intact, no footprints near the porch. Only then did she allow her shoulders to drop a fraction. The girls ran ahead, racing toward the cabin. Elias removed his gloves and turned to Naya. "We'll talk about those tracks later," he said quietly. Not in front of them. She nodded. "I want to help. If someone is near, I need to know." "You will," he replied, holding her gaze. "I'll keep you informed. You're not on the outside of this." The words settled heavily between them. Not romantic, not dramatic, simply honest. Inclusion mattered more to Naya than almost anything else he could have said. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled back to life. The girls chattered about the stones they had collected. The afternoon light filtered through the small window, warming the wooden floor. Naya stood near the doorway, watching the scene, feeling something shift inside her again. Something unfamiliar, yet steady. For the first time since losing her family, she sensed that she was becoming part of a place where her presence was not temporary, not forced, not tolerated, invited. The wind shifted overnight, sweeping across the plains with a firmness that carried dust, brittle leaves, and the faint smell of distant smoke. By dawn, Elias already felt something different in the air, a tension that didn't belong to the usual cold. He rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside before the first light touched the ridge. The horses paced restlessly, their ears tipped back toward the western hills. Even the chickens stayed unusually close to the coop. Elias paused, listening for anything out of place. The land responded with silence, but a silence that felt watchful. Inside, Naya sat near the stove, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders as she prepared to help with breakfast. Her eyes followed Elias the moment he stepped inside. She could read the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he didn't remove his coat immediately, the way he checked each window before speaking. "You saw something," she said quietly. "A few signs," Elias answered. "Tracks yesterday. Winds carrying smoke from somewhere it shouldn't be." Her posture tightened. "Could be travelers." "Maybe," he replied. "Maybe not." The girls woke a few minutes later, unaware of the shift in mood. Hannah rubbed her eyes and asked what chores they needed to do. June pulled on her coat before anyone else spoke, sensing the subtle tension between the adults, but not understanding the cause. Elias offered a short explanation. "We'll stay close to the house today. There's work to do here." Naya caught his meaning. He didn't want the girls wandering too far. She nodded once, acknowledging the quiet plan forming between them. After breakfast, Elias took his rifle from the wall and set it near the door, not out of panic, but as a precaution. Naya watched him carefully. She remembered men who carried weapons with arrogance, but Elias carried his with responsibility, never flaunting it, never using it to intimidate. The girls bundled up and stepped outside to feed the chickens. Naya followed them, breathing in the sharp air as she adjusted her focus to the tasks ahead. She could sense unease in the land the same way Elias did. Her tribe had taught her to read patterns, to recognize when nature shifted without explanation. As she scattered feed across the dirt, she noticed prints near the fence, prints she had not seen the day before. They were shallow but fresh, different from their own. Her pulse picked up immediately. She crouched and examined them closely. June saw her crouch form. More tracks. Naya nodded without looking away. "Not your father's. Not yours." June swallowed, suddenly unsure if she should call out. Naya stood slowly, placing herself between the prince and the girls. "Go inside," she said gently. "Help start the fire." The girls obeyed without protest, running toward the cabin. Naya followed, but didn't enter. Instead, she waited near the porch until Elias stepped outside again. The moment he saw her expression, he joined her at the fence without needing an explanation. She pointed to the ground. "Fresh." He studied the tracks. His jaw tightened. 3 men. Maybe 4. "How close?" she asked. "Close enough that we keep everyone inside today." Naya didn't argue. She understood the seriousness of unseen visitors near an isolated ranch. "Are they watching?" she asked. "Hard to say," he replied, "but they were headed toward the ridgeline. That's enough to make me cautious." She took a slow breath, letting the information settle. She had encountered enough dangers recently to know that caution could save a life. They returned to the cabin where the girls waited by the stove. Elias kept his voice steady as he spoke to them. "We'll do chores indoors today. No wandering. Understand?" Hannah nodded immediately. June hesitated, but eventually agreed. Naya helped prepare the cabin for a long day inside. She checked the water basin, stacked wood near the stove, swept dirt from the floorboards, and made sure blankets were within reach. She moved with quiet focus, instinctively securing the home the same way she once secured her camp. Elias watched her, not in a possessive way, not in a suspicious way, but in a way that revealed how much he had come to rely on her presence. He had been alone for years, making every decision without support. Now, having someone who recognized danger and responded without fear eased a burden he hadn't realized he still carried. As the morning progressed, the wind grew sharper. Loose boards near the roof creaked. The horses stomped and snorted. Dust drifted across the yard in thin sheets. Naya sat near the window, observing the hills for any sign of motion. She knew how to spot silhouettes at long distances, how to distinguish rocks from men, how to read shifts in bird patterns that signaled approaching movement. Elias joined her, carrying a cup of warm water. "Anything?" he asked. "No movement," she said. Not yet. June and Hannah sat at the table, working on small drawings the girls insisted on showing Naya every few minutes. Despite the tension outside, Naya responded kindly to each sketch, acknowledging their excitement with soft nods or small comments. Around midday, a sound broke through the wind, a distant crack, sharp enough to cut through the air. Naya stood instantly, her muscles tightening. Elias grabbed his rifle and stepped to the doorway. "What was that?" June whispered. "A tree limb," Elias said, though his tone suggested uncertainty. But Naya shook her head. "Not a tree. Something hit wood." Elias glanced at her briefly. He trusted her ear. He eased the door open and scanned the yard. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. No figures broke the horizon. He closed the door and locked it. The girls watched silently, sensing that this wasn't the kind of worry children should question. Naya stepped closer to Elias. "Tell me what you're thinking." "Someone's out there," he admitted softly. "Maybe hunters. Maybe drifters. But they're too close for comfort." "We should prepare," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For anything," she replied. He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a small hatchet he kept near the woodpile. She accepted it with both hands, understanding the gesture for what it was, a sign of trust, of partnership, of shared responsibility. Afternoons stretched long and tense. Naya kept watch from the window, rotating with Elias every half hour. The girls stayed near the stove, whispering among themselves, occasionally stealing nervous glances toward the door. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the wind slowed, leaving a stillness that made every small sound inside the cabin sharper. Naya stood with her back straight, eyes fixed on a single point in the distance. Elias stood beside her, the rifle resting against his shoulder. Minutes passed like hours. Then footsteps sounded, light, cautious, close to the porch. Not many. 2, maybe 3. Naya's hand tightened around the hatchet. Elias raised the rifle. The footsteps paused. A man's voice spoke from outside, low and uncertain. "Anyone home?" Elias and Naya exchanged a look, calm, sharp, ready. The peaceful days that had carried Naya into warmth and safety had changed, and the quiet life Elias had built was about to be tested. The voice outside the cabin froze every movement inside. Hannah pressed herself against June, eyes wide, unsure whether she should hide or stay still. June wrapped an arm around her sister, pulling her quietly behind the table. The stove crackled once, the sound too loud in a moment where silence felt like a shield. Elias lifted a finger to his lips, signaling Naya to stay steady. She already was. Her breathing slowed, her grip firm on the hatchet. Her eyes locked onto the doorway with unblinking focus. The voice came again, closer this time. "I saw smoke. Thought maybe someone could spare directions." Elias didn't answer immediately. Men who needed help rarely approached rural cabins at dusk. Their voices carried uncertainty, not casual friendliness. Elias weighed his options, respond and risk giving away that there were children inside, or remain quiet and risk provoking suspicion. He chose control. "Stay where you are," Elias called out, keeping his tone firm. "Who's out there?" A pause. Then, "Name's Turner. Got 2 others with me." A cough. "Hunters. Lost our bearings." Naya shifted her stance slightly, just enough so Elias could see her profile. The tension in her jaw told him she didn't believe a word. Hunters didn't travel in groups of 3 this close to settled land without gear, without dogs, and without announcing themselves long before the porch. Elias positioned himself so he could fire if needed. He didn't want violence, not with the girls watching, not with someone like Naya, who had already lived through too much, but he would not allow strangers to step into his home unchallenged. "State your business," Elias said. "Sun's down. This isn't visiting hour." "We're cold," the man answered. Didn't ask for much, just some heat and a bit of water. A soft crunch of boots on hardened soil followed. The men had moved closer. Elias recognized the sound of deliberate placement. Men trying not to startle, but also trying to intimidate by proximity. Naya stepped near the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see without being seen. Her eyes scanned the shapes standing outside. Three silhouettes, shoulders angled inward, hands near coats where weapons might be hidden. "They're lying," she whispered. Elias nodded once. He opened the door only a crack, keeping the rifle visible. The cold hit immediately, carrying dust and the faint odor of sweat and stale tobacco from the men outside. Turner stood closest, a tall figure with a heavy coat, beard untrimmed, eyes tracking every movement inside the cabin. The two behind him kept their hands low, not openly threatening, but not relaxed either. "You lost?" Elias asked again, voice controlled. Turner forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Snow 2 nights back covered our trail. Hard to follow anything in this weather." "No snow fell here," Elias replied. Turner's false smile vanished. His eyes hardened. "Look, friend, we're just trying to get by." Elias stepped out slightly, blocking the interior from the men's view. "You have a camp?" "No." "You have horses?" "Close enough." Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, then returned to them. "You're not staying here." Turner took a small step forward. "Not even for a cup of water?" "You heard me," Elias said. "Move on." The two men behind Turner whispered to each other. One shifted his weight, glancing toward the cabin with too much interest. Turner's gaze followed. "You got others inside?" he asked, pretending curiosity but revealing intent. Elias didn't answer. His silence was enough. Turner's eyes sharpened. Heard voices. "Keep walking," Elias warned. Inside, Naya held the hatchet behind her leg, ready to move the second anything changed. She saw Hannah trembling behind the table and positioned herself so the girl would be shielded if men forced their way in. Naya's heart beat with tense, controlled speed. Not panic, but readiness. She had faced danger before. She would not run this time. Turner tested boundaries again. Cold night to be stubborn. Elias lifted the rifle barrel slightly. Cold night to make a mistake. The standoff stretched. Wind kicked dust across the men's boots. The sky dimmed further, shifting from blue to ash. The tension sat thick between all of them, waiting for someone to break it. Finally, Turner muttered, "We ain't causing trouble. Just remember we asked polite." He stepped back. The other two followed, their silhouettes shrinking as they moved toward the darker edge of the yard. Elias didn't lower the rifle until their shapes disappeared beyond the fence line. Naya closed the curtains. Her chest rose and fell once, slow, deep, measured. Not relief. Calculation. Elias locked the door and turned to the girls. "You two all right?" June nodded, still gripping Hannah's hand. Hannah whispered, "Are they coming back?" Elias kneeled, so he met their eyes. "Not tonight, but we'll stay alert." The girls clung to him for a moment before going to the stove, seeking warmth and routine to steady themselves. Naya stayed near the door. Her eyes stayed fixed on Elias, watching the small tremor in his left hand, the one he thought he hid well. "They weren't lost," she said. "I know. They were looking," she continued, voice low, "for a place to take from." Elias exhaled slowly. They saw they were not easy to approach. That might send them on. "It might not," she countered. Their eyes held. Neither looked away. He spoke first. "We'll prepare. Nothing happens to this home while I'm breathing." Her expression shifted, part doubt, part respect, part something deeper. "I'll help," she said. "I won't let them near the girls." "I know you won't." He meant it. She read the sincerity and steadied herself around it. The rest of the evening passed with quiet purpose. Elias reinforced the doorframe with spare boards he kept behind the cabin. Naya moved a chair under the window to observe the yard without being seen. June and Hannah filled water basins, stacked blankets, and whispered instructions to each other like two small soldiers determined to do their part. Elias lit a second lantern but dimmed it into a low glow. Too much light would reveal silhouettes. Too little light would leave them blind. He checked the rifle, loaded each chamber carefully, and placed it within reach. Naya watched the steps he took, understanding them as signals of a man who had lived through violence and refused to let it reach his daughters. She felt a rare certainty form in her. She belonged in this moment, in this protective circle, not as an outsider, but as someone who would stand between danger and these children. When the girls finally fell asleep, curled together on one bed, Naya took the first watch by the window. Elias sat at the table, listening for movement outside. Hours passed. The land stayed quiet, but the quiet did not erase the truth. Someone had found their ranch. Someone had measured their defenses. Someone might return. As the lantern flickered, Naya thought of the day the raid shattered her life. The smoke, the shouting, the feeling of being hunted through the trees. She tightened her grip on the hatchet. This home would not meet the same fate. Not while she breathed. Not while she still had strength in her hands. And sitting across the room, Elias came to the same conclusion. They were no longer strangers, facing uncertainty alone. They were two people ready to fight beside each other. The night stretched long, holding the cabin in a suspended stillness that neither Elias nor Naya trusted. Outside, the wind had settled, leaving the land unervingly quiet. The animals in the corral stood close together, their silhouettes barely visible through the dim lantern glow that seeped around the curtains. Even the usual distant howl of coyotes stayed absent, as if the creatures themselves sensed something prowling beyond their territory. Naya sat near the front window, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the fence. The hatchet rested balanced across her knees. She had taken the first watch without argument, insisting Elias rest for at least a portion of the night. He hadn't slept. He'd only pretended for the girl's sake. His cot creaked softly as he stood and crossed the room, stopping behind her. "You should sit," she whispered, not turning. "Your shoulders stiff." "It always stiffens before weather changes," he replied. "Not from a man." "I can keep watch," she said. "I won't miss anything." He lowered himself into the chair beside hers. "We'll watch together." She didn't argue. The quiet between them was steady, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Elias studied the land, while Naya listened for subtle sounds, a twig snapping, fabric brushing, boots in the dirt. Her breathing stayed even, her gaze sharp and disciplined. After several minutes, Elias finally asked the question he'd been holding back. "You recognized those men's intentions the moment you saw them." "How?" Naya kept her attention on the yard. "Men who mean harm don't hide it well. Their movements are too quiet. Their eyes shift too often. Their hands stay close to weapons. And they show interest in houses where women and children might live." Elias thought about this before speaking. "You learned that young?" "Too young," she answered. "Raiders came through our land when I was a girl. My parents taught me to watch for warning signs." Her voice tightened. "Those men today, they weren't looking for shelter. They were scouting." Elias slowly exhaled. "I know. They'll return," she added. "Maybe not tonight. Maybe when the moon changes. But they'll come back because they saw something worth taking." His jaw tightened. "Let them try." Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, reading the seriousness in his tone. "You have it, girls. Your first duty is to them. And to anyone else who stands with us," he said. The words caught her off guard. She stared out the window again, unwilling to let emotion distract her from vigilance. Still, something shifted inside her, something steady, unfamiliar, and unsettlingly warm. Hours passed. The lantern dimmed. Shadows shifted across the walls as the stove's embers burned low. The cold crept in through the floorboards, but neither of them moved from their posts. At one point, Naya leaned slightly forward, narrowing her gaze on a patch of darkness beyond the barn. "Something's there," she whispered. Elias gripped his rifle and followed her line of sight. The shape was hard to define, too still to be a man, too large to be a stray animal. He waited, breath held. A moment later, the shape shifted, revealing the simple form of a tree limb fallen against the fence. He lowered the rifle with a slow, controlled exhale. Naya let out a breath as well, though hers came with a trace of frustration. "My mind reads danger into every shadow." "That's not a flaw," Elias said. "It's how you've stayed alive." Naya closed her eyes for a moment, fatigue showing in the subtle slump of her shoulders. "I don't know how to stop watching for danger. Even here." "You don't have to stop," he said. "Not now. Not while there's reason to stay alert." She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze for the first time in hours. In that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, respect, and a shared understanding that survival had shaped them both. The first hint of dawn finally appeared as a faint gray behind the ridge. The light flattened the shadows in the yard, making shapes easier to read. Naya straightened, adjusting her grip on the hatchet. Elias stood and moved to check the door. The cabin felt less suffocating now that darkness was thinning. "We should look around before the girls wake," Naya said. "We will," Elias replied. Quietly, they stepped outside when the sky began to brighten. Frost covered the yard in uneven patches. Elias scanned the ground immediately, checking for new prints. Naya walked ahead, studying the earth with deliberate care. She stopped suddenly. "Here," she said, pointing to a narrow track near the edge of the barn. Elias crouched beside her. The prints were shallow but clear, boot marks pressed into soft dirt where frost had melted slightly. He touched the imprint with 2 fingers. "Not ours." "No," she agreed. "Made after Turner left. 2 sets. Smaller tracks follow the deeper ones." "You're sure?" Elias asked. "Yes," she said. The smaller steps were hesitant. The larger ones were confident. Someone was pushing the other forward. Elias felt cold settle in his stomach. Men forcing someone else to scout wasn't uncommon among bandits. It meant information gathering. It meant return. "Look at the direction," Naya continued. She pointed toward a narrow gap between 2 hills. "They went that way. Close enough to see the cabin. Close enough to see us." Elias stood. "We need to prepare the girls." Naya stiffened slightly. "If trouble comes." He cut her off, not unkindly. "If trouble comes, we face it together." She looked at him, trying to understand the certainty in his voice. "Why do you trust me?" "Because you stayed awake all night to protect 2 children who aren't your own," he answered. "Because you didn't run when danger showed itself. Because you're stronger than you think." His honesty hit her harder than she expected. She looked away, unsure how to hold the weight of words she had never received from any man before. Inside the cabin, the girls were waking. Hannah rubbed sleep from her eyes, unaware of the new threat beyond the walls. June stretched and glanced at the adults, sensing the heaviness in the room. "Is something wrong?" June asked. Elias sat beside her. "Nothing you need to fear, but we'll stay close today." June nodded, trusting him completely. Hannah climbed into Naya's lap without hesitation, leaning her head against Naya's shoulder. The gesture startled Naya for an instant before she softened, placing a hand on the girl's back. Later, while the girls ate breakfast, Elias and Naya stepped outside again. The sun had risen fully now, revealing the expanse of the land. The quiet felt less threatening, but they both knew danger had left its mark. Elias broke the silence first. "If they come back, they'll come from the west." "Then we watch that side," Naya said. "We prepare escape paths. We keep the girls near the cabin. And we make it clear this home isn't easy to approach." Elias studied her face. Strength and fatigue mingled there, but beneath both lay something new, determination. "You're not running?" he asked. "Not anymore," she answered. He nodded slowly. "Good." She looked out at the plains as a breeze moved across the dry grass. Her voice softened, almost hesitant. "Elias, if something happens, you protect the girls first." "And you?" he asked quietly. "I know how to survive," she said. "I won't fall easily." Elias stepped closer, his voice low, firm. "I'm not leaving you behind in any fight. Understand that." Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of someone choosing to stand beside her. Before she could answer, the horses in the corral stamped nervously, their ears turning toward the horizon. Naya and Elias followed their gaze. Dust rose from the ridge. Not wind. Movement. Naya's fingers tightened around the hatchet. Elias reached for his rifle. The danger was no longer a question of if. It was here, and whatever came next would change the shape of this fragile, forming family forever. The dust rising from the ridge thickened as the figures moving through it came into focus. Elias steadied his rifle against his shoulder, adjusting his stance to get a clearer view without revealing his silhouette. Naya stood beside him, gripping the hatchet with controlled strength. Her jaw was firm, her breathing even, her focus unbroken. The cold wind carried the scent of unsettled dirt and distant sweat. The men appeared slowly. First Turner, then the taller companion, and finally the thin man who trailed slightly behind. They rode horses this time, meaning they had regrouped and planned their return. Turner's posture was different now. Confidence replaced pretended helplessness. His eyes scanned the property with the measured calculation of someone determining how difficult a fight might be. Elias stepped down from the porch before the horses reached earshot. He didn't shout. He didn't call for negotiation. He positioned himself plainly in the center of the yard, letting them know he expected them. Naya remained near the corner of the cabin, close enough to cover Elias, yet still hidden enough that the men couldn't count how many defenders there were. She glanced to the windows. June and Hannah watched from behind the curtains, faces pale but trusting. Turner slowed his horse, raising a hand as though the gesture would soften his approach. "Morning, Rourke," he called out. "We didn't finish our conversation last night." "You finished it," Elias replied. "You were told to leave." Turner feigned disappointment. "I figure maybe you reconsidered. You got supplies, animals, shelter. The winter's rough in these parts. Sharing makes sense." Elias kept the rifle lowered but ready. "Your needs are my responsibility." Turner chuckled, the sound humorless. "I wasn't asking permission." Naya tensed. The other two men spread slightly, forming a loose arc around Elias. They were waiting for a sign. Turner's nod, a shift of Elias's grip, anything. Naya read the space between their movements. She had been taught to see not just where men stood, but how they intended to move. The tall one's boots were angled toward the barn. The thin one kept glancing at the window where the girls watched. Turner's horse pawed at the dirt, nervous from the tension its rider created. Elias didn't back up. "Turn your horses and go," he said. "You won't get another warning." Turner leaned in his saddle. "There's 3 of us. One of you." "That's your mistake," Naya said, stepping into view with the hatchet angled down but unmistakably ready. Turner blinked, surprised. "So the woman speaks now. She defends this home," Elias said. Turner studied Naya with new interest. "She the reason you're suddenly brave?" Elias didn't react, but Naya saw the twitch of irritation he hid beneath calm. She stepped closer to Elias, aligning herself shoulder to shoulder with him, signaling unity in a way no words could convey. Turner sighed. "I tried polite, but there's too much here to walk away from." He lifted his hand. The tall man spurred his horse toward the barn. The thin man dismounted and moved on foot toward the cabin, likely hoping to reach the girls. Naya moved first. She sprinted toward the thin man, cutting the distance with startling speed. He froze for a second, surprised by her determination. That hesitation cost him. She struck his arm with the blunt side of the hatchet, forcing him to drop the pistol he had been reaching for. The weapon clattered into the dirt. She kicked it away, positioning herself between him and the cabin door. He lunged at her out of anger, but she sidestepped, using his momentum to knock him off balance. He fell hard, scraping his palms. She raised the hatchet again, not to kill, but to make sure he understood she would not allow him to rise. "Don't move," she warned. He didn't. Elias faced Turner, who now raised his revolver toward him. The tall man near the barn circled, unsure whether to charge or retreat. Elias kept his rifle steady, eyes fixed on Turner, ignoring the shaking horse beneath the man. "You shoot," Elias said calmly. "You won't get a second shot." Turner hesitated. Elias's voice held no fear, only certainty. "Let's settle this," Turner growled, "one-on-one." "There's no settling," Elias answered. "Turn around and leave." Turner pulled the trigger. The sound cracked through the yard like a slap of thunder. The bullet tore a line through Elias's coat, but missed flesh. Elias fired back instantly, aiming for Turner's hand rather than his chest. The shot hit clean. Turner's revolver flew from his grip, landing several feet away. Turner shrieked, clutching his wounded hand. His horse bucked wildly, unseating him. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. The tall man saw the exchange and pulled his horse to a sharp stop. His confidence collapsed. He stared at his injured leader, then at Naya, who still stood poised, balanced, and unflinching. This place isn't worth dying for, the tall man muttered under his breath. He kicked his horse and galloped away without looking back. The thin man, pinned under Naya's unyielding glare, lifted his hands to his head. I'm done, he said quickly. I'm done. Don't hit me again. Naya didn't blink. You won't come back. He nodded frantically. Never. Elias approached Turner slowly. The wounded man spat dirt and rage. You're a fool, Turner hissed. You'll lose everything someday. Elias lowered his rifle. Maybe, but not today, and not to you. Turner glared up at Naya with spite. He'll regret taking you in. Sooner or later, he'll regret. Naya stepped forward before he finished. I lived through worse men than you, she said calmly. And I don't run anymore. Turner's expression cracked, revealing something beneath the bravado, fear. Genuine, sharp fear. Elias grabbed Turner by the collar and hauled him to his feet. Take your friend and go. If either of you shows up again, I won't aim for your hand. The thin man stumbled to help Turner mount his horse. Within seconds, both men were galloping across the ridge, leaving behind a churned path of dust and humiliation. When the last trace of the horses disappeared, Naya lowered the hatchet. Her hands trembled for the first time since danger began. Not from weakness, but from the sudden flood of the moment ending. Elias stepped toward her. You all right? She nodded, swallowing hard. You? He touched the torn fabric on his coat. Bullet just grazed the cloth. Nothing more. Relief washed through her so quickly she nearly collapsed, but she steadied herself before her knees could buckle. The girls burst out of the cabin, running toward them. Hannah threw her arms around Naya first, burying her face against her stomach. I saw him fall, she whispered. You made him stop. June hugged Elias tightly, checking him for injuries. Naya crouched, pulling Hannah close. The child's small body shook with leftover fear. Naya wrapped her arms around her gently but firmly, grounding both of them. Elias rested a hand on June's back. It's over, he said softly. You're safe. The girls clung to the adults who had protected them, their trust complete and unbroken. After the shock settled, Elias and Naya stood together in the center of the yard. The danger was gone. The land felt different, lighter, calmer, as though the ranch itself exhaled. Elias turned toward her. You didn't have to stand with us, he said. But you did. Naya met his gaze, something steady and warm forming behind her eyes. This is my home now, she said quietly. Where else would I stand? He absorbed her words slowly, as if afraid they might break if rushed. Then he reached for her hand, not forcefully, not hesitantly, but with a steady simplicity that carried everything he had not said aloud. She accepted it. The girls watched, smiling in a way that children smile when they understand something important has changed forever. That evening, the four of them sat together near the stove. No fear lingered. No shadows threatened. For the first time since Naya arrived, the cabin felt whole. Not because danger had passed, but because they had faced it as one. When the girls fell asleep, Elias looked across the dim room at Naya. The firelight revealed the softened tension in her posture, the peaceful steadiness in her breathing. He spoke quietly. Stay, not out of fear or duty. Stay because this life is yours too. Naya stepped closer until she stood within arm's reach. I choose this home, she said. I choose you. I choose the girls. Elias nodded, a rare moment of emotion passing across his usually composed face. Then we build something together. She rested her forehead gently against his, a gesture of trust rather than romance, a promise made without dramatic declarations. They stayed like that several seconds, neither needing more words. Outside, the wind carried only calm. No threat rose on the horizon. No stranger circled the land. The ranch stood quiet, stable, and claimed. Inside, a family, once shattered, once scattered, sat bound not by blood but by choice. And Naya, for the first time since losing her tribe, felt not safety alone but belonging. Real, enduring, chosen belonging. A life rebuilt, a future secured, a home earned. The story ended not with fear, but with peace. Not with uncertainty, but with the beginning of a life they would share together.